ladies and gentlemen, the latest labels they have found for Satyajit Ray are Bharat Ratna and Renaissance Man. The paper distributed for this seminar also describes Ray as the product of Indian Renaissance. They call him the last glorious representative of the Indian Renaissance. What, pray, is the Indian Renaissance? I would like to know. History is quite silent about it. We once heard historians talk of a Bengal Renaissance, yes. But an Indian Renaissance is a recent invention of the government in New Delhi. When did this mythical Indian Renaissance begin? And when did it end? Or perhaps it is continuing at this moment, secretly, in the movement for smashing the Babri Masjid and building a Ram temple in its place. Perhaps the Indian Renaissance is to be discovered in the burning of a sati recently in Rajasthan, or in the great Indian sport of burning brides for dowry. Or perhaps the mass poverty and illiteracy of India are the hallmarks of the great Indian Renaissance. Claiming Ray's genius for something that is essentially Indian is a shameless bluff, and merely reminds one of how every Greek city claimed Homer after his death. The government of India, as usual, woke up late after a night of revelry and discovered a genius in Calcutta and hastened to confer something called the Bharat Ratna on him only because the Americans had given him the Oscar. Of course, previously, Ray had won every prize the film world had to offer, at Cannes, at Venice, at Berlin. But of course, they are only European prizes and don't count. Oxford University conferred a doctorate on him, but of course you have to be somewhat learned to realize its importance. The President of the Republic of France flew to Calcutta to pin the Legion of Honor on Ray's jacket. But then France has no 7th Fleet, and we are not holding joint naval exercise with her. But an American award is a different thing altogether, you know. So the game of sharing in Ray's glory began in great haste in Delhi. And since the man was already in coma, it was safe to heap the Bharat Ratna on him. Men in coma cannot refuse awards. The experience of trying to include Subhash Chandra Bose in the honors list had been rather bitter. So the Bharat Ratna was graciously awarded to an unconscious man. But our rulers in Delhi oh dear, excuse me. Our rulers in Delhi can't resist a joke. The Bharat Ratna was awarded to Ray along with Mr. J.R.D. Tata. All one can ask plaintively is why Mr. Birla or Mr. Bajaj should not also be included in the great company of Satyajit Ray. The invention of this myth of Indian Renaissance and making Ray its representative is similar to this late attempt to claim a share in all the honors the world has showered on him for so long. It is ironical that the USA is the only country in the world that has not yet commercially shown any of Ray's important films. In fact, the American people remain ignorant of what his films mean. The Oscar comes from a small group of film specialists. The game is clear. We honor you, we worship you, but your creations are not wanted here. Our audiences will be fed on American trash and trash only. We do not want a trade rival in this country. The India government's hypocrisy is equally brazen. It is shameful that while it was conferring its highest award on Ray, it has kept Ray's film on Sikkim under a ban. We know only too well the antics of the corrupt coterie that controls the Indian television. They have suddenly waken up to their boss's belated appreciation of the last representative of the Indian Renaissance and showed some of his films after his death, but making arbitrary cuts and censoring bits of dialogue. Their miraculous intervention changed Ray's three daughters, his film Three Daughters, into two daughters. One story having been totally cut out. They cut line after line of dialogue in Ghore Baire and wanted to stop Sadgati from being shown because the word chamar has been used repeatedly in the film. Please note, Sadgati is a film made specially for the TV, and challenging its dialogue constitutes an attack jointly on Ray and Munshi Premchand, its writer. Pretty bold of the TV, one would think. No respecter of persons. Thus, the government of India has substantially the same attitude to cinema as the US Academy. Personal adulation for the filmmaker, but neglect for and even opposition to his films. Ray's films, as well as films by various young experimenters in the film today, need protection from the film mafia of big tycoons who control distribution, production, and every aspect of filmmaking. The government of India considers the film industry only as a source of endless taxation and believes a golden handshake with the dying Ray will exonerate it of all its sins. The government of India appears to be a local branch of the IMF. As far as India's cultural world is concerned. It is at this moment inspired by ideas of a market economy, of free capitalist growth. In other words, surrendering the young filmmakers to the mercy of the big capitalists of the cinema. And it approves heartily when the young filmmakers are denied channels of release and driven from the field. Free competition is the watchword, competition between millionaires and paupers. And if the paupers cannot survive, why, they can go and look for jobs elsewhere. This is the substance of an exit policy enforced on the cultural world, the forced exit of every serious filmmaker, leaving the field clear for an unending supply of trash. In the arts, trash always sells better than classics. Penny dreadfuls can always knock Tolstoy out. Herein is the role of the government if it is interested in educating its people. There can be no free market in the arts, just as the government cannot resign its responsibility to check and restrict the sale of heroin. Similarly, it cannot sit back and say, Ray must freely compete with Bombay. If the government of India were not composed of a bunch of Shylocks, it would have realized that if people are given the opportunity to watch serious films for some time, they would reject the gruesome, mindless violence of the commercial cinema and demand more and more socially conscious films. It is a fact that originally Ray's films were not patronized in Calcutta to the extent that could be socially significant. But as he began to pour out more and more films, Ray addicts grew fantastically in number, until the release of a new Ray film became a danger signal to the commercial cinema in West Bengal. This is a lesson that the government of India should have learnt, that classics have to have channels of release somehow to reach the people. Then they become irresistible. Of course, a government which consists of hirelings of moneybags cannot interfere with their free market and set up the new cinema as a rival to rubbish. Rubbish has therefore been ennobled by a new name here in India, the mainstream cinema, thus declaring to the world that the mainstream of Indian art flows in channels of imbecility. All this began with Pather Panchali, which the highest executive of India, of the government of India, saw in Calcutta and went red in the face. Fuming, he asked Mr. Ray whether showing such poverty on celluloid will not bring India to disrepute in the eyes of the world. A typically Indian question, one would suppose. Appearance is all that Indian rulers believe in. Mr. Ray's answer put the executive down immediately. If it is not disreputable for you to tolerate such poverty in this country, why should it be disreputable of me to show it? This cry has been repeated again and again, that films should not present the stark reality of Indian life, but must whitewash it. Pretend, as in the mainstream cinema, that every Indian drives a Mercedes, and that a taxi driver goes home and routinely turns on the AC before going to bed. That every Indian girl sports an exotic hairdo. That thus alone can Indian honor be defended abroad. The cry has been heard from big capitalists as well as from disgruntled, frustrated actresses of Bombay. A big Calcutta newspaper, while defending The City of Joy, an American film being shot in Calcutta, wrote, "If Mr. Ray can show the abject poverty of Calcutta, why should this foreign director be denied that right?" It is like saying, why should Bombay films be denied the right to show violence and rape, since Shakespeare shows them freely? All these organs of big capital were spreading a scare about Ray and the new Indian cinema, that these films do not entertain and make you worry about problems, so avoid them at all cost. Go where the beautiful girl gets soaking wet in the rain while she sings a rollicking number, and the macho boy single-handedly knocks the toughs out. This is the real India, where there is no inflation, no unemployment, and no suffering. Ray has shown Indian artists their responsibility to society, that they must be truthful, that it is not only their right but duty to probe poverty and expose it, lay it for all to see, and ponder the inhumanity of it all. To mix Ray up with the maker of The City of Joy is a low-down trick. The people's objection to The City of Joy in Calcutta was not because it showed the poverty of Calcutta, but that it was lying. Monsieur Dominique Lapierre wanted to probe Calcutta's underworld without knowing a word of Bengali or Hindi. And in the process, the things he was about to show, he discovered a tiger from the Sundarbans straying into Calcutta. He spoke of Calcutta's overcrowding. Calcutta is an overcrowded city, but do you know why Calcutta is overcrowded? Because this overcrowding was caused by refugees from the Himalayas who had fled the Chinese invasion of India in 1962, and they all flocked to Calcutta, you see. That's why Calcutta is a crowded city. And he records a flood in Calcutta, within living memory, a flood in Calcutta where all the ground floors of all the houses, literally all the houses, had been inundated, and corpses were floating in so thick you could not see the water in places. The people objected to the portraiture of a so-called mafia in Calcutta. He also discovered a mafia in Calcutta, borrowed from the exploits of Amjad Khan and Amrish Puri in Hindi films, without any verisimilitude to Indian reality. The City of Joy was crass imperialist propaganda calculated to malign India, and hence the peaceful movement in Calcutta against it. Let us therefore drop the word Indian before Renaissance when assessing Ray's work. There has been no such thing in history. Historians for a time spoke of a Bengal Renaissance, beginning with the rise of Desrosiers the teacher in the 1820s through the work of Ram Mohan Roy, Vidyasagar, Michael Madhusudan Dutt, right up to Rabindranath Tagore. But historians have now withdrawn the word Renaissance from this upsurge of progressive ideas in Bengal and call it simply the Bengal Reform Movement. They now argue, and rightly, that a Renaissance presupposes the existence of a revolutionary bourgeois class who, through the upsurge of Renaissance ideas, advanced to capture a power and a democratic revolution. The British imperialists prevented the rise of the Indian bourgeoisie, and therefore Renaissance is idle talk in India. But perhaps they have reached a governmental decision in Delhi to use the word Renaissance loosely, to describe certain qualities of Ray's art, irrespective of historical context. History has never been a strong point of the bureaucrats of Delhi. One remembers with horror the various histories of the Indian freedom movement compiled by them, where India appears to have won freedom because she dutifully wove khadi and drank goat's milk, where the naval mutiny of Bombay does not appear to have happened at all, where Subhash Chandra Bose and the INA are given 5 lines of dubious prose, where Bhagat Singh is actually criticized for being a Punjab terrorist. If the word Renaissance has been thus loosely attached to Ray, one expects an analysis of his works to trace Renaissance thought in them, what these ideas are, and how they have appeared in his films. But alas, for that one requires not only a knowledge of film art, but also extensive reading in Renaissance literature, neither of which, one is sorry to note, is available to the numerous secretaries who run the actual task of governing this country. When Mr. Ray was dying, they were busy discovering the identity of the gentleman who used Mr. Solanki as a courier to Mr. Felber, and even more busy trying to conceal this identity. Renaissance literature does not fit into this routine. The only explanation of the expression we have heard over the TV is Mr. Ray's amazing versatility. That a man can be a filmmaker, designer, painter, writer of note, music composer, songwriter, book illustrator, and an acknowledged authority on the art and history of printing is inexplicable to them, and therefore they seek to explain it all by a convenient label, as if versatility is the principal characteristic of Renaissance men. But Leonardo da Vinci is not a universal model of Renaissance genius. He was an exception in his time also. The other great exponents of Renaissance ideology were men who specialized in just one field and yet molded the thoughts of their age. One has never heard of Michelangelo doing anything but paint and sculpt, or Shakespeare doing anything but write plays, or Machiavelli taking time off from political pamphlets to sit down at the harp and compose a sonata. Single-minded devotion to a single art does not negate their claim to being Renaissance men. The Renaissance released a deluge in Europe which changed primarily social relations, struck a blow at the dictatorship of the church over men, released the creative energies of men, drove the aristocrats and feudals from positions of social dominance, and generally laid the foundation of a revolution. The ideas that rose from this storm will have to be painstakingly traced and related to their relevance in Ray's films before such labels can be stuck to him. Time does not permit us to do it here on the spot. All we can do is identify certain general trends in Ray's films and see if they conform to the ideas of the European Renaissance. European Renaissance, not Indian, of course, because no such thing exists. The Renaissance brought man to the center of attention. Before the Renaissance, man was merely a Christian, oppressed by the original sin and a toy in the hands of God. The Renaissance freed man from this intellectual slavery and portrayed him as one who shapes his own destiny by his own will and passion. If there had been anything called an Indian Renaissance, Indians would have been freed by now of belief in Kismet and the pantheon of gods directing man's destiny, and in the burden of a past birth and sins committed therein. Already in Pathe Panchali, Ray's protagonists suffer not because gods have willed it so, but because of poverty created by men. They are evicted from their home by a power that is stronger than gods, a social system that condones exploitation. And this revolt against a concept of gods who crush human beings reaches fruition in Devi, where a girl, a common housewife, is declared a goddess incarnate, and is expected to heal and cure every sick villager, until the boy she loves more than her life is dying and is placed before her so she can touch and heal him. She dare not play with this boy's life and tries to flee. Her sari torn and her mascara running all over her face. One has merely to compare this film with dozens turned out from the cinema machine of this country, where a dying child given up for dead by medical science is placed before the image of a goddess, and of course there is a lengthy song glorifying the goddess, be it Santoshi Ma or some such forgotten local deity. Then the stone image is seen to smile or to drop a flower on the boy's corpse. And lo and behold, what the best doctors could not do, the piece of stone achieves in a second. The corpse opens its eyes and even sits up. This is followed by another unending song of thanksgiving, or the boy's parents weeping and rolling on the ground to show their gratitude. This kind of brazen, shameless superstition is peddled by film after film in this country every year. Are they any less dangerous than drugs? If drugs destroy the body of our young men, these films destroy their mind. A proper tribute to Ray would have been to make it impossible to make such filth, and instead to make arrangements so that films like Devi can be shown all over the country at cheaper rates. Devi is a revolutionary film in the Indian context. It challenges religion as it has been understood in the depths of the Indian countryside for hundreds of years. It is a direct attack on the black magic that is passed off as divinity in this country. Instead of the vulgarized Ramayana and Mahabharata, the Indian TV could have telecast films like Devi again and again, and so maybe today we would not have to discuss the outrages of the monkey brigade in Ayodhya. Incidentally, Ray also planned to make a big budget film on the Mahabharata, on the gambling scene in Mahabharata. He had an international cast in mind, headed by Toshiro Mifune. He appealed for funds from the government of India, which turned the Bharat Ratna's appeal down immediately. But it thought nothing of pouring crores into the England Ratna, Richard Attenborough's whitewashing of English imperialism in Gandhi. So, more funds for the England Ratna than Bharat Ratna. Renaissance ideology was mainly a bourgeois democratic ideology and therefore had to herald the death of feudalism and the suicidal excesses of the aristocracy. Ray's Jalshaghar is a masterpiece in this sense. The lonely, drunken aristocrat living alone in a massive palace, alienated from life and his fellow men. Doom appears to be written across the tortured face of the Lord, whose pride equals his financial bankruptcy. The history of overturning social relations has been captured in this film with the same unmistakable certitude as in the chronicle plays of Shakespeare. And the social question is emphasized when the little bourgeois visits the Lord. The bourgeois who is a Philistine towards art and beauty, but rich and arrogant. He even tries to toss money to the Lord's dancing girl and is prevented by the Lord's stick touching his arm. One can only compare this to the usual portrayal of landlords in Indian commercial films, which not only consistently glorify the Lord's kindness and charity, but even where the young hero is shown as a poor boy from the village, you can bet it will be proved at the end that this boy is actually the Lord's long-lost son. His pedigree has to be established, damn it. A peasant's son fighting for justice cannot remain a peasant's son at the end. That would be propaganda for the Mondal Commission. Shatranj Ke Khilari does the same thing with Mughal feudals, who are so devoid of love of country that they play chess while the English imperialists imprison and drag away their master, and their country is enslaved. They could not care less. Where Ray goes way beyond Renaissance ideology is when he chooses to chronicle his own time, such as Sadgati. We see the heavily lined face of the Indian working man, perhaps for the first time in Indian cinema. We have been given glimpses in other films of the Indian proletariat, usually as a slogan-shouting union man in the background, waiting for an Amitabh Bachchan to use his fists to knock the exploiters out. Mainstream films have consistently portrayed the workers as tame middle-class types who wait for a messiah to come and liberate them. Sadgati is the first Indian film to capture the real Indian worker who is doubly exploited as a worker and exploited as lower caste. In fact, Sadgati is the prehistory of the present Indian proletarian movement, which began in an atmosphere of Brahminical scorn and contumely. The Ray of Sadgati is certainly not a Renaissance thinker, but a poet of the contemporary world, confronting the elements of class struggle. We can extend our study to his last films and see the same political process working in his active, superbly contemporary mind. Ganeshatru, based on Ibsen's Enemy of the People, does not end as Ibsen ended his play, which was Dr. Stockmann standing alone against the world and declaring that the individual is always right and the majority always wrong. Ray knows this is no longer true in today's world, where the masses of people have advanced to a political role in society. Ganeshatru therefore ends with a procession of working men who have arrived to help Stockmann fight his battle. Or take Shakha Proshakha, where Ray flays the immorality of our middle class that is wedded to the capitalist ideal of making money. Or take Agantuk, where Ray indicts civilization, which is so-called civilization, which can wipe out a city by pressing a button, and at the same time showers contempt and hatred on tribals of the world who have not learnt the art of murder. One has a sneaking suspicion that all this talk of Renaissance ideas may well be a ruse to remove from sight the living contemporaneity of Ray's ideas and relegate him to a museum of ancient statuary which has ceased to bother us now. This suspicion is strengthened when we consider a film like Ray's Hirok Raja Deshe, which was his response to Mrs. Gandhi's emergency decree. This film, in the guise of a fairy tale, is a blast against all forms of dictatorship, which believes in thought control, prison for the workers, arrests and deportations, but all the while it is actually preparing its own ultimate destruction. Renaissance is an inadequate term for Ray. He was a moment in the conscience of men. Thank you very much.